deal with the issue of gaming, whether it be casinos or whatever else, that more of the members needed to understand all the parts of the equation. Um, the folks that heard it from Jay Lark last week are essentially in finance and appropriations, and so but they won't be the first committee to hear it. So that's why we felt like we ought to go ahead and get this thing before more sets of eyes and ears, and so that we go into January with a better understanding of what has to happen if we're going to do anything, if we're going to deal with this factor or that factor, and if we do, how we will deal with them. Since we're not going to take any votes today, there's no point in calling a roll. So, Tracy, are you going to make the introduction, or are you going to just let Joe go? Or Hal, were you going to make the introduction of Tracy?
I'll defer to Tracy.
Mr. Chairman, I wasn't planning to, but I'd be happy to. I guess just to say that this study came to us as a bit of a surprise, but we put a full team of analysts on it and worked on it on a full-time basis for the past 9 months or so. Worked with 2 national consultants to help us out and supplement our research. I'll let Joe introduce the team, but I oversaw the study, one of the studies that was under my supervision this year, and it's just been a real pleasure and privilege to work with this team on this issue. It's been very interesting. We've learned a lot, and hopefully what we've been able to provide to the members will help you all deliberate and make decisions going forward with the information we've provided. And we're happy to provide any additional follow-up on questions that you might have that we're not able to answer today. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe.
Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. As Tracy mentioned, my name is Joe McMahon, and as the project leader for our review of gaming in the Commonwealth.
Joe, pull that mic up
sure.
a little straighter.
Up at the table with me is the study team. Of course, before that, you know our director, Hal Greer. Tracy Smith was the associate director overseeing the project. I was the project leader. Our analysts were Stephanie Paps and Dylan Wild. Eric Beecroft, our methodologist, also worked closely on the project, and we had a team of consultants that I will introduce here in a few slides. Can you give me a view show? Okay, thank you. That was easy. Okay. The mandate for this study called us to evaluate additional forms of gaming in Virginia. We were directed to estimate potential fiscal and economic impact of new forms of gaming, its impact to existing forms of gaming, and look at oversight structures for governing, regulating, and administering additional gaming, largely by reviewing casino gaming laws in other states. Before I launch fully into the presentation, I want to leave the caveat that this presentation is a high-level review of our key findings and takeaways. It's hard to do justice to the report of this magnitude, so there's much greater detail in the report. We're happy to answer questions now or as follow-up to any of that information. As part of the study, JLARC staff hired a consultant, the Innovation Group, a national consultant with experience in the gaming market research and analysis. And as part of the engagement, they partnered with Regulatory Management Counselors, or RMC. Together, the consultant team estimated the state and local fiscal and economic impacts of gaming expansion and identified gaming governance and regulatory and administrative structures used in peer states. The JLARC study team worked closely with the consultants on those topics throughout the study. Our study team also did its own independent research that included data analysis, conducted 90 interviews with key stakeholders, carried out an extensive literature review, and we also sent a team member to a week-long accredited seminar in casino regulation at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Overall, our study found that the 5 casinos authorized by Senate Bill 1126, in combination with sports wagering and online casino gaming, are projected to generate nearly $370 million in net state revenue. All 5 potential casinos are projected to be viable with a gaming revenue tax rate of 27%, which is the median gaming tax rate among states with commercial casinos. We found that lottery and charitable gaming proceeds are projected to experience small declines in proceeds, but the impact on horse racing revenue would be substantial. Problem gambling risks could increase, but could be mitigated with a robust state-run treatment and prevention program. In addition, we found that issuing casino licenses through a competitive selection process would maximize potential benefits and minimize public risk. And finally, administrative costs of a gaming oversight agency are projected to be about $17 million to $19 million annually, and Virginia Lottery could oversee casino gaming but would need additional resources to do so. Our presentation is divided into 7 sections. I'll start off with some background on the legislation from this past session and talk about existing gaming in Virginia. As you know, Senate Bill 1126 was passed during the 2019 General Assembly session. It sets forth the broad framework for expanding gaming in Virginia via commercial casinos. It has a reenactment clause, meaning it would have to again be passed during the 2020 session in order to take effect. The legislation authorizes casino gaming in Virginia to be overseen, regulated, and administered by the Virginia Lottery. It authorizes a single casino in 5 cities, Bristol, Danville, Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Richmond, of which the Pamunkey tribe is the sole entity eligible to own a casino in Norfolk and Richmond. A voter referendum would have to be passed in each city to allow casino gaming before a license could be granted. And Senate Bill 1126, along with language in the Appropriation Act, is what directed this study. Furthermore, we studied sports wagering because it was also considered during the 2019 General Assembly session through several bills, none of which were passed. And we also examined online casino gaming as it's been a topic in discussion and was directed in the study mandate. Virginia already has a robust gaming environment. Virginia's permitted forms of gaming generated nearly $700 million in revenue in 2018. This includes $606 million from the Virginia Lottery for public K through 12 education, $59 million from charitable gaming operations for qualified nonprofits, and $12 million for the horse racing industry via horse racing wagering. Further, new in 2019, Virginia now has historical horse racing wagering, which is pari-mutuel wagering on devices that are similar in appearance to a slot machine. You may know these facilities by the Rosie's brand name. The gaming revenue from HHR is not included on this slide here, but will be a substantial addition in future years. I'll now move on to the fiscal and economic impact of additional forms of gaming. This work was largely completed by the JLR consultant, the Innovation Group.
Mr. Chairman, would you like us to ask questions now or at the end?
Go ahead and ask, as long as you don't mess up his cadence too much.
Well, that's why I hope to get in between the
No problem.
transition. Can you give us a little more information on, if it's going to be later, you can just tell me that, on Rosie's? I'm most familiar with what it looks like in my area of the state, but I'm curious. I see whenever I drive anywhere in Virginia, I see advertisements for it. Mm-hmm. Just how extensive is it, and what does it look like across the state?
Right now, today, there are 4 open HHR Rosie's facilities. Those are the Colonial Downs Racetrack, Richmond, Vinton, and Hampton. There's Danville. You may have seen the news. Danville and Dumfries just passed referendums to allow pari-mutuel wagering, so those are possible future sites. And Chesapeake is also a site that had been planned but is currently somewhere in between. That I would have to get further information to know where that stands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so the Dumfries, so if I'm familiar with what it looks like in Vinton, mm-hmm. and if I saw the other places, would I see the exact same thing? And is Dumfries, if they go forward with it after this referendum, is it basically going to be another Rosie's as well?
Yeah, so on the Dumfries question, and there in Vinton, there's a 150 machine limit that's set by the Virginia Racing Commission's current regulations. The regulations state in a smaller locality, there's a 150 machine limit. In a larger one, there's a 700 machine limit. So Richmond, Hampton, and New Kent, where
Are
Colonial
much
Downs is,
larger than.
can have up to 700 machines, and I think they are at that number or close to it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, just one quick question to walk back. You had said 27% was the median tax rate of other states. I was wondering if you knew offhand, or if it'll be later in the presentation, our neighboring states, like Maryland, what their tax rates are?
We talk about in generalities in later
If you could
slides,
either,
but I can answer that now because I'll may not remember as we get to it. The numbers that we report in our report are effective tax rates, so it's blending together whether there's different rates on slot machines or table games or a graduated rate. Maryland, off the top of my head, comes out is 36%. Delaware's 39. Pennsylvania 44, and West Virginia is even a little higher than that. West Virginia is 47. And what page is that, Eric?
It's on page 42 of the draft report.
So, page 42.
I'm going to keep
Sure.
the interruption going for
No
a minute.
problem.
Is that all state taxes, or is that a combination of state and local taxes?
That is a combination of all the taxes, and it varies by state. Some states it is all a state tax. Some states there's a state component and a local component, but
And that's true in those states also?
that is a combination, yep.
Okay.
And
Mr. Chairman.
Pennsylvania has a state and local component.
Mr. Chairman.
They're both there.
A follow-up on that and on the prior one. I mean, in Maryland, at least that's what I'm most familiar with, given that one of the casinos is right across the river from my house, and I can see it when I walk my dog. They have different rates at different casinos, right? I mean, they have a different tax structure. I mean, in one of their casinos, I think the state might own the slot machines, and they get some kind of piece of that, and it's not by tax. And I mean, it's not just simply a statewide tax, right?
That is correct in Maryland. The state is moving away from the state-owned slot machine model. I don't know if they still own any or not, but they are moving to private ownership of those slots. And they do have a different tax rate by casino that varies mostly on the slot side. I think it ranges from about 50 to 60% of slot revenue. Table games, I think, is uniform across the state. So it does differ, but it's not a huge difference.
Got it.
What were you going to follow up?
Not on that. Something
Well,
else.
I want to follow up on that. Why is there a difference?
That is a good question. I can't speak to the exact reasons. Do we know that? I think part of it is just the profitability potential of the market. A bigger, more profitable market has a slightly higher tax rate.
Mr.
I
Chairman.
think we might need to delve into that.
Okay.
To try to find out a little more as to how they came to that structure.
Mr. Chairman, I have another question back on Rosie's. The Rosie's, or the HHR revenue projection you had, I think you said, what, was it 12 million a year or something?
That 12 million was from traditional horse racing wagering, so actually betting on the race. The HHR net gaming revenue projection from our consultant going out 5 years is 299 million in net gaming revenue annually.
Annually, 299.
Yep.
Okay. Follow-up question, Mr. Chairman. So the regulations that you cited with the 150 machine cap and the 700 machine cap, those regs are temporary regs, and the final regs are scheduled to be voted, I think, in pretty soon, like in the next 2 or 3 months, and those limits could be lifted or theoretically reduced, right?
Theoretically, yeah, I think they could change the regulations at any point.
And the follow-up question, one last. And the 299 million a year does not assume any money from Danville or Dumfries?
No, it does not. It does assume Chesapeake, though, which is not open yet, because when the model was built, that was the assumption at that
Got
date.
it. Okay, thank you.
And it also does account for those current regs and those limits on the machine. That's built into the projections as well.
We might as well continue on that track. How is horse race off-track regulated?
Just the traditional wagering from off-track
No,
facilities.
no, I
It's-
mean, who is doing the
Oh,
regulation?
it's all the Virginia Racing Commission, both the HHR machines and the traditional betting on live horse races.
As we look forward, and that would be one question, is should there be one organization that regulates everything, or should they be left separate?
Yep. And we do have some information on what other states do to that effect in our report, and we have a recommendation that a few years down the line, regardless of what happens, if there is expanded gaming, to evaluate whether other types of gaming, like charitable gaming or horse racing wagering, should all be rolled into one agency or not. Thank you. Again, this section will be the fiscal and economic impact of additional forms of gaming. This work was largely completed by JLARC's consultant, the Innovation Group. However, all the methods and assumptions were closely overseen by the JLARC team, including our methodologist, as well as Dr. Terry Rafan, who's a regional economist with the Weldon Cooper Center at UVA. The Innovation Group projected the fiscal and economic impact of various gaming scenarios, including a casino in each of the 5 localities identified in Senate Bill 1126, the impact of an additional casino in Northern Virginia, the impact of competition from potential new facilities in neighboring states that currently do not have commercial casinos, and that's Tennessee and North Carolina for the purpose of this analysis, in the fiscal and economic impact of sports wagering and online casino gaming. They also assessed historical horse racing gaming, both with and without casinos. When discussing fiscal and economic impact, by fiscal impact, we mean gaming revenue taxes paid to the state, as well as other state and local taxes from traditional tax sources. And economic impact is largely from job creation, wages, and contribution to the state's gross domestic product, or GDP. A few more assumptions to lay out before we start going through the numbers. The projections for this study are for 2025, which is assumed to be the second full year of casino operation. They account for projected changes in income levels and population between now and then. And importantly, unless otherwise noted, the casino projections are for a scenario with a 27% tax rate applied to gaming revenue, which, as I said earlier, is the median rate assessed across states that have commercial casinos. We did, however, look at higher and lower tax rates as part of our analysis, and that will be discussed later in the presentation. And finally, when we refer to gaming taxes, that is the tax applied to gaming revenue and not standard state taxes like sales tax, corporate income tax, or personal income tax that would also be paid by casinos and their employees.
Mr. Chairman,
Excuse me.
you got 5 licenses, right? That's what we're going for?
Yes, that's.
How much are we going to charge for a license? Did you guys look at that?
We did. We looked across states and tried to standardize between the amount of, or the cost of a license and the length of the term. And based off our analysis and standardizing those, I can't recall the page offhand, but it's roughly in like the 15 to 30.
You can give me the page.
But yeah, based off the size of the market, roughly 15 to 33 million dollars upfront for a 15-year license.
And does that cover all the ancillary things like enforcement and regulation, and those positions are going to be needed for that? Because we have the same issue with ABC, with agents and enforcement in that. So, and our fees don't cover those costs. So has that been done? That work's been done?
Yeah, and
33 million's the number, huh?
Yeah, and that's a policy call, whether all that money goes towards covering the cost or whether that money goes to a different purpose. All states will also use a portion of their gaming tax revenue on an annual basis to cover those costs. And a lot of times the licensing of key individuals and employees at the casino also comes at some cost too, meant to cover, at least offset part of the cost.
I noticed in the report it said localities will suck up almost $61 million worth of financial hardship based on that. So is that worked into the number on the fee as well? Was any of that consideration?
As far as money going to localities?
Well, there's going to be an impact to localities of $61 million. Was that worked into the fee that you're going to ask? You're given 5 licenses to print money. So was that worked into the license at all for localities concerned?
That price of the license is based off what other states have charged and what would be competitive relative to some of our peer states.
Okay.
It's not trying to back out the numbers for the cost of licensing or cost of localities.
Okay, all right. And what's the page number?
Page 90.
Thank you.
Move on to our first finding here. Our review found that state gaming tax revenue from a casino in all 5 localities is projected to be $262 million at a 27% tax rate, and that amount would vary greatly depending on the rate that is applied. One of the key metrics for measuring the fiscal and economic impact of a casino is its annual net gaming revenue. This is the amount of revenue collected from gaming activities after deductions for the cost of prizes and promotions. Simply, it's the amount upon which the tax is levied. Taken together, the 5 casinos are projected to generate a total of $969 million in net gaming revenue, ranging from $130 million in Bristol to nearly $300 million annually in Richmond. From this net gaming revenue, the state would receive $262 million in gaming tax revenue at the 27% tax rate. Another key metric to look at is how much casino revenue would come from out-of-state customers, because this out-of-state revenue represents a net gain to the state tax base and economy. The Innovation Group estimated that because of their proximity to the border and population centers in other states, a Danville and Bristol casino would generate about 3/4 of their revenue from out-of-state customers. The amount would be now down near 10% for the other 3 locations. Statewide, the total casino gaming revenue projection from out-of-state customers is 32%. And here it's worth mentioning that in a scenario where casino gaming were adopted in Tennessee and or North Carolina, Danville and Bristol would be the most vulnerable to that new competition. Our study found that casinos would generate additional revenue through other state taxes and add to the local tax base in host localities. The Innovation Group's analysis projects that casino gaming would generate $29 to $33 million in state tax revenue beyond that from gaming taxes. Additionally, the Innovation Group's estimates show that the introduction of casino gaming would generate local tax revenue ranging from $3.7 million in Bristol, which would be equal to 8% of the city's total local revenue this past year, to $8 million in Richmond, which would equate to about 1% of local revenue. These local tax collections would be primarily through real estate taxes and the local share of the sales tax. Figure 2.3 on page 17 has the breakout across all the localities. Our next key finding is that casinos would have a positive economic impact, but that impact would be modest relative to the broader local economies. Further, job creation would be one of the primary economic impacts, with the number of new jobs ranging from 0.3 to 3.2% of the local labor force, with a median wage of $33,000. Each casino is projected to directly employ at least 1,000 people, with about 7,600 jobs across all of the casinos combined. These are the people working directly at the casino, and they're estimated to account for about 70% of the total expected job creation. The full economic impact includes the secondary jobs created elsewhere in the economy due to the presence of a casino, such as someone working at an advertising firm or a
Mr.
gaming
Chairman?
equipment supplier. Good.
Let him finish that.
Okay, on the slide, okay, at the
The,
end.
the last, there's projected to be 3,200 secondary jobs for a total of over 10,000 jobs statewide.
Okay, now. Adam.
I apologize. The secondary jobs are jobs that are not in the casino?
Yes, it's an economic analysis in terms of the ripple effect where other businesses supporting the casinos, like a game equipment supplier or.
Thank you.
Okay. The projected jobs that work directly at the casino would account for 3% or less of the local labor force in the 5 host localities. To define the labor force, we looked at where workers in the locality are actually commuting from on a daily basis. For example, over 1/3 of the workers in Bristol, Virginia commute daily from Sullivan County, Tennessee, so that county is included as part of the Bristol labor force for this analysis. Localities with a smaller labor force, such as Danville and Bristol, would experience the greatest positive benefit with projected casino employment accounting for 3.2% and 1% of their respective labor forces. Casino jobs would have a smaller impact in larger localities, and that impact is projected to be in the 0.3 to 0.4% range. While small as a percentage of the labor force, there's projected to be at least 1,000 jobs directly at each casino. This would be meaningful in all 5 localities because each has an unemployment rate that is above the statewide average. There's a more mixed story for the wages of casino employees. The Innovation Group projected casino employee wages on a full-time equivalent basis using industry pay data. Over half of casino jobs are projected to pay lower wages, but many would be higher skill and wage. For example, you'll see these top categories of staff, including executives, managerial, and accounting, that have relatively high wages. And on the other hand, about half of the jobs are projected to be lower wage and are mostly those in food and beverage or housekeeping positions. And overall, that median wage is projected to be about $33,000 per year.
Mr. Chairman,
Scott?
I think when I read the report last night, you didn't include any or make any projections about the jobs that would be created by the construction itself, right? And the economic impact from the actual construction, or?
We do have those.
Is that in there?
We touch on those very lightly in our report. Our consultants report from the Innovation Group has much more depth on those numbers. I can speak at a very high level.
I see. Is it a one-time total of $1 billion of statewide GDP?
Yeah. It roughly works out where if you annualize that construction impact and put it all into 1 year, it's approximately equal to the annual GDP and jobs of casino operation on an annual basis. That just happens to be how it works. It's like another year of impact, basically.
And that impact would occur before the 4 years, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That would primarily occur during the construction phase, which is
Right.
about 18 months to 2 years leading up to opening the casinos.
Got it. Thanks.
The median wage of casino jobs is projected to be lower than the median wage in each region hosting the casino, being closest to the median wage in Danville and Bristol.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. Did you all look to see whether any other states require a higher wage for people working in a state licensed business like this as part of their licensing process?
No, we didn't look at that. That's potentially something we could follow up on, I think.
Yeah, I think it'd be pretty easy to ask that question and see whether other states have done it.
Okay. I didn't, in our research, I didn't hear about it, but that doesn't mean it's not going on. Now to switch topics away from casinos to other types of gaming we were asked to look at. We found that sports wagering and online casino gaming would generate additional revenue and jobs, but much less than casinos. Sports wagering and online casino gaming could have a modest positive fiscal impact compared to casinos. Sports wagering revenue will vary depending on how it's implemented. This can range from brick and mortar locations only, such as a sports book at the 5 casinos, to a combination of brick and mortar locations and online and mobile availability. Along that spectrum, tax revenue from sports wagering is projected to range from $22 million with limited wagering availability to $55 million with both physical and mobile offerings. Online casino gaming, which is, as it sounds, is online versions of casino games and is not to be confused with other online or mobile options such as lottery or sports wagering. That type of gaming is projected to generate $84 million in gaming tax revenue once fully implemented and mature. While they have tax revenue potential, the economic impact from sports wagering and online casino gaming would be expected to be small. If sports wagering is implemented with a brick and mortar component, there would be some capital investment and employment with a projected economic impact equal to 10% or less of what is expected from the 5 casinos themselves. Online casino gaming is not projected to have a material economic impact since it's mostly automated and the operators tend to be out-of-state vendors. Next, in addition to the 5 Senate Bill 1126 locations, we examined the fiscal and economic impact of a casino in Northern Virginia to gain the understanding of the potential for Virginia's largest region. We found that the casino in the Northern Virginia market would generate additional positive fiscal and economic impact. A Northern Virginia casino would be projected to generate a net increase of gaming tax revenue of $155 million beyond that generated by the other 5 casino locations. Likewise, it's projected to create 4,400 total jobs and contribute $700 million annually to the state GDP. These amounts of impact are equal to about 50% increase compared to the 5 Senate Bill 1126 casinos combined. Furthermore, a casino in Northern Virginia is projected to attract substantial amounts of gaming dollars from out-of-state customers or from Virginians that currently spend gaming dollars in another state, totaling about $311 million from those 2 sources combined. And finally, it would be expected to pose little competition to the other 5 locations due to its geographic separation.
Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, sir, could you go back a couple slides when you're speaking to the sports wagering? When you then talk about online casino gaming, is that in relation to sports wagering or just?
No, I had that little caveat there. It's completely separate. So like online sports wagering, for the purpose of our analysis, is considered sports wagering. The online casino gaming I'm talking about is casino games, slot-like games or card games played online.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, did you consider the online component of sports wagering? And that is in?
Yes,
that,
and that's on that high end of the spectrum. So there's that range being brick and mortar only with the $22 million in tax revenue to 55 with a fully online plus brick and mortar.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Thank you.
Chairman, have you thought where a casino would go in Northern Virginia?
Right beside your house.
And I'm thinking, you know, typically these things prosper, I think, where there's a less affluent population. I mean, those are the people who go in and gamble. And so are you thinking about just where it might go? I mean, I'm thinking about Arlington. Got some folks over there that really enjoy going down and putting on a bet.
We did not consider a location there. As far as the revenue potential for a casino, it's largely driven on population, the wealth of that population, and the ease of access. The more people, the more money, the easier to get to, the more money a casino is going to make. And then the opposite is true. So really, for this analysis, our consultant used what they called a centroid. They just kind of centered it off a population center. We didn't even have knowledge of where that was because we didn't want to presuppose any locations.
And did you find that typically experience shows that they prosper in areas that are not the wealthiest areas?
Not necessarily. It really is, like I mentioned, it really is partially influenced by the income. And a higher income area will, I mean, there's just more money to spend on leisure activities and more money to spend on a visit. So as far as the income levels that go to a casino more, I don't think we looked into
Folks
that.
with lower income are more likely to go to a casino,
Right.
but they don't have as much to bet as people who have higher incomes. So National Harbor, right outside DC, one reason they generate $700 million a year in revenue is because that area is one of the wealthiest areas in the country. So it's more about the wealth, but you're right, lower income tend to participate at higher rates.
So more poor people gamble, but the wealthier people who do and gamble more.
Generate more of the revenue, that's correct.
And that all these revenue projections, our consultant does account for the income level of the areas of the state.
Mr. Chairman? Yeah. One follow-up question.
Sure.
Taxation rates in relation to online sports betting. Is there a table in the report? I might have missed it in relation to that.
There isn't, most states with sports betting are kind of in this 10 to 15% range. Some states doing online only, like Tennessee, are up, it's like the 18% range on revenue. There's a couple outliers higher than that, but that tends to be where they lie.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, if maybe we could, if it's not in the report, if we could get that in
Yep.
terms of taxation rates in relation to online sports betting, that'd be great.
In relation to online only or just in
Online
general?
sports betting
Okay.
only.
Now transitioning to the topic of taxation. This part of the presentation will focus on the taxes applied to casino gaming revenue. Our first finding is that a casino in all 5 locations contemplated by legislation would be projected to be viable under a 27% tax rate applied to net gaming revenue. For this section, I'd like to emphasize that the tax rates assessed here were chosen to illustrate and conceptualize the relationship between tax rates and economic impact. We are not recommending these specific rates, and minor differences in rates, such as 12% and 15%, might not have a material impact on, or a material effect on economic impact. Now I'll walk through a little bit of background. Market demand and the tax rate applied to gaming revenue are primarily what influence the size and scale of a casino. Size and scale and the corresponding employment and economic impact is largely determined by the volume of gaming activity that the surrounding market will support. At some point, it doesn't make sense for a casino owner to keep adding scale, amenities, and hiring more staff if there's just not the population and visitation to justify that investment. At the same time, tax rates have a modest impact on the size and scale of a casino, but they have a greater effect on the state gaming tax revenue. High tax rates generate far more tax revenue for the state, but can result in less economic impact because the casino owner will have less money to invest into the property on things like additional amenities and employment. As you'd expect, the opposite can be true as well, or is true as well. Lower tax rates result in far lower state revenue, but owners and operators can have more profit available to invest in the property to generate additional economic impact. Another key principle is that higher tax rates are common in states with a limited number of casino licenses. Open casino markets, examples of which include Nevada and Mississippi, have an unlimited number of casino licenses available. These states tend to have lower tax rates in order to allow for the casinos to be more profitable since they often face more competition. The 5 states with an open license market have gaming tax rates ranging from 7 to 15% with a median of 12%. On the other hand, states that limit the number of licenses, like Virginia would under the current legislation, have less competition. As a result, casinos can be more profitable, and therefore these states tend to have higher tax rates, ranging from 19 to 50% with a median of 33%. Using these findings from other states, the Innovation Group, in consultation with the JLARC study team, evaluated 3 tax rates for Virginia casinos. These include 12%, 27%, and 40%. Senate Bill 1126 does not set a tax rate, but earlier versions of the legislation had rates ranging from 10 to 15%. We use the 27% tax rate as our starting point. At that level, a casino in all 5 localities would be expected to be at least a small resort-style facility. Senate Bill 1126 has a $200 million capital investment minimum, and the Innovation Group projected that a casino of this scale could be built in each city at the 27% tax rate. This $200 million casino would be approximate to a small resort-style property, which means it's projected to have a hotel, meeting and/or entertainment space, and dining options. Further, at this size, there is projected to be at least 1,000 or more jobs directly at each facility. Our next finding is that a lower casino gaming revenue tax would result in substantially less state revenue while being projected to contribute only modest additional positive economic impacts. Those additional economic impacts would be most apparent in smaller markets like Bristol and Danville.
Mr. Chairman?
And
Thank you. On slide 33, you mentioned that it would result in a smaller resort-style casino with hotel, meeting, entertainment space.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything we can do to kind of guarantee that? If we put a license in that in order to get a license, you had to have these things, that's not a deal killer, right? I mean, we can require these things.
Yes, and the legislation does have that $200 million minimum requirement, I think, as a way of getting to that, because around that point is when you start to get those things, but I don't see why you couldn't be more specific if you were inclined to be.
And as a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, I would ask, do we know if any other states do that in order to make it so you just don't have gamblers, that you
Yeah.
draw in more people? I mean, for example, I go to National Harbor, and I don't think I've ever, I know I haven't ever bet there. But I have interest in going to concerts there, or parties, or restaurants. Do we know if other states require physical things rather than dollar amounts?
I know there's for sure dollar amounts. I don't know about physical things. They do.
Great.
I'm told they
Thank
do.
you.
And another, which we'll get to here in a minute, another way to address that is through a competitive process where you're looking at a number of proposals so you can potentially weed out ones like you described that are they're just a gaming floor versus one that's more of a amenity-filled facility.
And the developers have some incentives to build these amenities too, because it helps maximize their overall profit and revenue.
This slide is to orient the committee on state revenue projections. With a 12% gaming revenue tax, the state would be projected to receive $122 million annually. That grows to a projected $262 million at a 27% rate. And finally, at a 40% rate, there'd be projected $378 million in state tax revenue each year. The trade-off between...
As we move forward, we probably ought to get more frequent intervals, I would say, from the 20 to 40% range. I don't think we can go as low as 12%, but I think we ought to see what the return would be on every couple of percentages.
That's additional information you would like?
Yeah.
That...
I was just going to add, Senator Ruff, I think that Joe will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way that the analysis has been done, we had to pick the 12, 27, and 40 in order to get the most accurate estimates possible. I do think that 27, for example, is meant to be illustrative, and that it could maybe go down to 22, 21, 20, and you would still see roughly the same types of economic impacts. And certainly I think we could probably rough in the revenue from that. But I think to do full-blown analysis on specific numbers that looks at the economic impact as well as the revenue impact, we'd have to work with our consultant to do that.
Yeah.
It might take a little bit of time, but we can work with you
to do the full-blown analysis on different rate would be a pretty substantial undertaking for the consultant. But as Tracy said, we can use these 3 points in time, and there is a relatively linear relationship, and at least draw out point estimates in between those numbers.
Mr. Chairman?
And again, I want to, these are all projections as well, so
Sure.
putting a lot of specificity on 20 versus 25, we would have to caveat that enough to say that, again, this is all projections.
Yes, I'd just like to see a little more
Sure.
definition
Yep.
in that curve. Yes.
One question, would we have the option to do different tax rates on different areas? So as you're saying, the Danville area, if it were a higher tax rate, would be more difficult for it to be successful. So could we engineer it so that it was more specifically
Yep.
targeted to each location?
Yes, there's absolutely a way to do that as well. And we talk about that a little in the report, and I'm about to hit on it a little bit here too. So the trade-offs between those amounts of revenue on the previous slide is a modest change in the total economic impact. For example, at a statewide level, levying a 27% gaming tax instead of a 12% tax would be projected to more than double revenue for the state, but would have the negative effects of decreasing casino employment by an estimated 8% and decreasing annual GDP generated by the casinos by 6%. A similar relationship is seen between 40% and 27%. So that was the statewide picture.
Mr. Chairman. So why does a higher tax rate negatively affect employment?
It's basically a higher tax burden on the casino. They're going to invest a little bit less in the property, less in the amount of amenities, which would then require a smaller workforce and smaller wages paid to that, or less overall total compensation to the workforce. It's basically their profit margin's thinner at a higher tax, so they're going to scale down the operation to some extent.
Follow-up question? Well, some of us up here are talking about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour at some point in time, which, while $15 an hour doesn't come out to $33,000 a year, some people would argue would have the effect of increasing everybody above it as well, as other people start to compete for higher jobs and we raise the floor for everybody. So the labor costs associated with operating a casino, especially in these areas where a $15 minimum wage might be a lot,
Yes.
could have an effect. And I'm seeing, it seems to me that if you increase that base cost of operating the casino for the employment cost, it seems to me everything at the casino gets more expensive. And so it's not clear to me why increasing the tax rate just makes everything at the casino more expensive. I'm not clear how it has an impact on employment. That's.
It's basically, for them, it's an equation of how much revenue we can generate and then how much of that is kept as profit. And like I said before, the bigger driver is how much revenue can be generated off that local market. I don't want to get lost saying that taxes are the only thing that impact this, but the taxes do have that impact of if they can make this amount of revenue, the customers going in don't know whether the tax rate's 40 or 20% on the casino. They just know that the games they're playing have the same odds and payouts that they're used to. So you're not going to see a big revenue increase as the rates change, but you'll see a decline in profitability, so the casino will reduce scale and employment.
Casinos have to pay out a certain amount of their in winnings to get people to keep coming and gambling. If the payout rate is too low, people won't spend money there because there's no point. So they have pretty much a fixed payout that they have to make. So that determines how much revenue they're going to take in versus how much they're going to pay out. And it all leads to like a gaming revenue. And if you split that gaming revenue between the state and the owners of the casino, and the state takes a bigger share of that, the casino owner is getting less. And if they're getting less for the amount that they're investing, then the optimal investment amount goes down. They're going to invest a little bit less. They're going to build a little bit smaller casino, which means less revenue, which means less revenue, state revenue.
Mr. Chairman, follow-up question. So I can understand how a state tax might reduce the amount of money available for payouts. But isn't it true that a higher, if the employees are being paid a higher wage, either because the minimum wage is higher and overall wage rates go up, or we mandate those employees be paid a higher wage, that would not affect employment at the sites?
We didn't assess how any change to minimum wage would affect employment at the casino.
Or whether if we mandated a higher wage for casino employees, whether that would affect employment.
Yeah, that gets a little bit complicated because it depends on, it's like for any business, if you increase their labor costs, it depends on who's going to pay that increase. And so for some businesses, they raise the prices of their product and it gets passed on to the consumers and things don't change that much. Employment levels don't change that much. If an employer can't pass on those higher labor costs, then maybe they cut back on their labor. So it depends a bit on the particular industry.
And to Eric's point, a casino can only go so far in lowering their payouts because players expect a certain amount of winnings, essentially. So the casino doesn't have that much ability to generate more revenue from that same amount of gaming. They're kind of locked in at where they're at. So
for example, a slot machine, for every dollar bet, they pay out something like 92 cents. So they keep 8 cents out of every dollar on average. So it's a pretty high payout rate. If you have a lower payout rate than that, people tend to not spend as much time in the slot machines, they make less money.
Mr. Chairman, one last question. Just edify me for a second. is the only game where they can alter the payout slots? Because I thought with like roulette and blackjack and poker, it's more a question of the cards that pop up in the deck, and they can't really stack a deck, so, right?
Yeah, table games, I'm not an expert in this area by any means, but don't tend to have a more fixed payout over time that just general statistical probability will.
Well, there's
will
also
lead to.
skill involved in table games that there isn't in slots. Slots is just luck.
But
But
slo-
on average, the skill evens out, so you can
Sure.
project what you're gonna make off
But in
table.
the slots, you're telling me they actually adjust the payout rates based on what they need to do to hit a profit?
No, that's pretty much just consumer behavior. Through trial and error, through experience and testing, they figured out what the payout rate needs to be in order to maximize the revenue they get out of a particular slot machine. So it depends on, like, someone comes up to play a slot machine, how long are they gonna put money into that slot machine before they leave, right? They wanna maximize the amount of time they're putting money into the slot machine. And that depends on what they're getting back, how fast they burn through the money that they came to play with. So that's how they get an 8%. And that's kind of independent of whatever the state decides to take, whatever share the state decides to take of that 8%.
So what payouts can they alter then? You said they alter their payouts.
No, they don't alter. They can't really alter the payouts. That's the problem. That's why when the state takes a bigger share, there's less left over for the owner, for the casino owner. So there's less profitability. That's why the state tax rate affects how much the casino owner is willing to invest in the property.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so those numbers that I just put out there were the statewide picture. However, the trade-off between the tax rate and the economic impact is projected to vary across different gaming markets. Lower tax rates are the most likely to result in additional, albeit modest, economic impacts in smaller localities like Bristol and Danville. In those locations, it could make more sense financially for a casino owner to increase the scale of a facility in an effort to attract customers from the population centers and further reaches of their markets, about a 2-hour drive time away. On the other hand, a larger market like Richmond could support a large-scale casino at a high tax rate and would likely only see a marginally larger facility and additional economic impact at a lower rate. This is because casinos in larger markets generate more profit, can afford a higher tax burn, and don't have to build out as much because they can be supported by their local customer base. Finally, like Richmond, the Hampton Roads market is large, but competition between a casino in both cities would make it difficult for the region to support a resort-style casino at a high tax rate. On the other hand, a low tax rate is projected to result in substantial foregone state revenue, accompanied by just a modest additional casino scale and impact, because that market could likely be adequately served by 2 casinos built at the median tax rate. Chapter 3 of our report, in particular pages 35 to 40, lay out the trade-offs statewide and at each of the localities in much greater detail. The General Assembly has several considerations when setting a casino gaming tax. It should balance fiscal impact to the state and economic impact for localities. A few examples of how to potentially achieve this include a graduated tax that increases rates as gaming revenue increases. This would give a lower tax rate to casinos in smaller markets or for those facing competition with one another. Another way to get the same principle could be to levy a different tax rate by host locality or region. However, as you know, tax structures can quickly become overly complex, so simplicity should be another consideration in this process.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
A question about that. So I understand the idea of the progressive taxation. Would not if we based it on the location of the casino, wouldn't that end up becoming problematic because it'd be special legislation and we'd have issues with that? I mean, is there any reason that we would, if we, which, I was a huge supporter of this, if we were to do it, is there any reason to do it that way?
With a different tax by region?
Yeah. I mean, what's the case for that? It just seems problematic to me.
Yeah, it definitely has trade-offs. The case for it is that, like I was just going over, a Bristol that has a smaller customer base and could potentially benefit from being able to build out larger would more likely expand and add more to the property at that lower tax rate, whereas a Richmond casino might not. So there are advantages in that you can maybe better optimize your tax rate across casinos. But the trade-offs are that you run into fairness issues with different casinos under different rates, and it is more complex.
Thank you.
At this point, I was going to pause as we're going to transition from a lot of the numbers and revenue projections onto some other topics. So for any more questions on that first, roughly half of the presentation, I could take those now, or I don't hear any.
Can you give us an example of a state that uses a progressive rate? That, do they do it, say, on the first 100 million at 1%, one set percentage?
Yep.
And then at 200 million?
Yep. It's like any graduated, basically income tax rate, where below a certain threshold, this percent, and it goes up as revenue increases.
Can you, at some point, give us a couple of states
Oh, yeah,
that have
yep.
done that and see where they break?
Yep. Yeah, we have all that information.
Mr. Chairman.
Scott?
On the revenue side, are there any other states that have other taxes that generate revenue on this? Like, for example, I know at MGM, they have all these events. I think Senator Evan talked about it, but for like an events tax, so that when they're having concerts, you're getting $1 on every ticket, or a meals tax on the meals that are being sold, or a hotel tax on the people that are spending the night to go in. I mean, I didn't see any chart of those kinds of taxes, and I know in some states they're probably state taxes, other places they're local, and there's a mix of that in Virginia too. I mean, did you all look at any of that kind of revenue impact?
We didn't get into the granular details of some of those, I don't know what to call them, smaller rates of taxes, but those would absolutely apply on various different food and beverage taxes or occupancy taxes. But those are not in these, and partly to be conservative and not put out too big of an estimate, and partly because just the complexity across states gets pretty detailed pretty quickly.
Further question, Mr. Chairman.
Continue.
So is it fair to say that, at least in the consultant size, that those types of taxes did not have a significant effect on the viability of casinos, that the main variable that matters is the gaming tax?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
So moving on to our next section, which is the impacts to existing gaming in Virginia. We found that casino gaming would have a relatively small negative impact on revenue generated by the Virginia Lottery and charitable gaming operations. However, it would have a more substantial negative impact on the revenue generated for the horse racing industry, largely due to casino competition to historical horse racing gaming, referred to as HHR here. The Innovation Group projects that lottery proceeds would be reduced by $30 million, or about 3.6%, once casinos are fully operational. All lottery proceeds are used for public K-12 funding in Virginia, so that annual reduction would be equal to about 0.5% in total state funding to K-12. The Innovation Group projects that charitable gaming proceeds would be reduced by $3.1 million annually, or about 4.4%, once casinos are fully operational. However, that impact would be uneven across organizations conducting charitable gaming, and would be greater for those located in or near localities with a casino. As an example, that could mean an estimated reduction of $36,000 in gaming proceeds for one of the large charitable gaming operators in Southwest Virginia, and that would represent a 12.5% decrease to its total gaming proceeds. Casino gaming is projected to have a more substantial negative impact on Virginia's horse racing industry, coming from an estimated $9.4 million reduction in annual revenue to horse racing stakeholder groups. This would occur as a result of a projected 45% decrease in HHR gaming revenue. A portion of that revenue is paid to the horse racing stakeholder groups. A substantial portion of that funding to those stakeholder groups is used to support live horse racing in the state. The reduction in revenue may hinder the industry's ability to expand and meet its goals for the amount of live racing in the future. To address this, stakeholder groups could potentially reallocate funds from other horse racing industry programs and operating costs to fund the purses for live racing. The schedule could be expanded, but to a lesser degree than targeted, Or, as is the case in many states with casinos, additional funds from gaming revenue could be allocated to horse racing.
Mr. Chairman? I thought, I'm trying to find the slide again, but I thought you all said the projected HHR revenue is $299 million a year.
Yes.
So how does a 40% reduction of 299 turn into $9 million?
Yes, I think that slide, it may be trying to squeeze too much information there. Of that 299 million, the agreement that the HHR operators has with the horse industry stakeholders is that roughly 7% of that revenue goes to the horse racing industry. So off 300 million, that 7% is $21 million. So then the 45% reduction to that 21 is what gets you that 9. So that total net gaming revenue, only a small portion that's going to the horse racing industry.
So I'm clear, the general fund, the HHR general fund revenues are 299 million, you said, right?
No, that is the net gaming revenue.
Oh,
So-
that's net revenue?
Yeah, so
Oh,
that's
okay.
the,
All right,
that's the
never mind.
basis
Got
where
it.
the
Okay.
state,
I
local,
got it.
and
Got it.
and
Okay.
horse racing share is applied.
Got it.
The breakouts of that specific equation are on pages 52 and 53 of the report that shows the percentages of where that 299 goes.
Sorry, what page?
52 and 53.
Okay.
Next, I'd like to turn to overseeing and regulating additional forms of gaming. To address this topic, the team, with the assistance of our consultant, RMC Legal, undertook a review of regulatory and oversight structures, administrative resource needs, and casino gaming implementation processes in other states. The first thing to share with you is what we learned about how other states select casino projects. This is an area where they spend a lot of time and effort. We found that issuing a casino license through a competitive selection process maximizes potential benefits and minimizes public risks associated with the project, and is a strategy commonly used in nearly all other states. A majority of states limit the number of casino licenses available, and as discussed earlier, the proposed legislation here in Virginia would do the same. 11 of the 13 states with a limited license market use a competitive process to select casino developments that would receive those licenses. A competitive selection process is meant to reduce the risk that a casino project will be unsuccessful. Limited markets have few casino licenses available, and once awarded, those licenses are typically held for a long term. That means there may be only one opportunity to get it right with a successful project. A competitive process helps to mitigate this risk by seeking to identify potential casino owners and operators that are qualified, financially stable, and experienced. Furthermore, a casino license is a very valuable commodity as being awarded by the state. In return for the value of that license, a competitive process helps a state maximize impact by choosing a project with the highest fiscal and economic impact. We saw numerous examples in our research about how an open competition led to a project with more capital investment or job creation. These benefits, minimizing risk, maximizing impact, and testing the market, are the same principles that drive the traditional public procurement process used by the state in other areas. As a result, we recommend that the General Assembly require that casino licenses be awarded through a competitive selection process.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
In your review of other states using a competitive or RFP process, was there any state in particular that did a good job at balancing some of the questions that you've heard today in terms of community impact, benefit, taxation rate, sort of the resort style and other elements that have been discussed both in JLARC as well as in the committee today?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit in a minute here about how they balance some of the local interests and the statewide perspective. As far as your other questions about the capital investment in wages and jobs and impact, we did see examples where that the selection committee was able to look at 3 proposals and select one that did have higher projected impact. That was also evaluated to be able to potentially meet those goals. I don't know if that directly answers your question.
Just follow up, Mr. Chairman. So is there a particular state that did a good job or a selection process that did a good job from your perspective and research that sort of stands out?
I think Maryland was, my team's giving me that example, and that is something we heard during our research.
Mr. In Maryland, they have these casinos called Maryland Live. What basis would we, I know the MGM is a great asset economically, but these Maryland Live casinos, from what I understand, are standalone. I don't think they have that economic development from what I've heard. Correct me if I'm wrong, and that they are more of a lower income casino attraction where, I guess I'm judging, but where people are going to lose their money who maybe couldn't afford that. When you say it's a success, were those Maryland Lives done through a competitive process also?
Yes, they were, and I think those are relatively large facilities with some other amenities. I mean, they're not on the MGM scale, but almost nothing is.
Okay, I haven't been to one, I've only heard, so thank you.
The Innovation Group has some. The Innovation Group, our consultants report, early in the report, has some profiles of different casinos in other states that tells hotel rooms, employment, things like that, so. Next, we found that as part of the competitive selection process, states use expert consultants that independently verify the feasibility of casino proposals. Casino proposals, like you've seen in other types of economic development, may overpromise anticipated revenue or economic impact. Projections that fall short of these promises hurt the state and locality because they miss out on an expected benefit. Furthermore, when projections are not met, other states have seen casino owners seek to have their gaming tax rate lowered, reduce their level of community commitments, such as payments to the host locality, or lay off workers. Most states use expert consultants to evaluate proposals upfront in order to identify and manage these risks. Therefore, we recommend that the General Assembly may wish to consider including a provision requiring an independent consultant hired by the state assess whether projections in casino proposals are accurate and reasonable prior to selecting a winning proposal. Next, we found that as part of the competitive process, states set criteria for evaluating and selecting casino operators and their proposals. Furthermore, they rely on a committee of experts and local input to evaluate the strength of proposals. Typically, authorizing legislation will set broad parameters for selection criteria, with the request for casino proposals, or RFP, being used to set more specific criteria. This criteria typically falls into two groups, as to maximize the impact and to minimize the risk of projects. Sample criteria to maximize impact include looking at the total value of a project, including its capital investment, employment, and wage projections. Criteria to reduce risk can include feasibility and sustainability of the project or an operator's experience.
Just a question. Backing up just a little bit, where you recommended the use of consultants to independently verify feasibility of casino proposal. Who are these expert consultants? Aren't they just tied to the casino industry?
There's a handful of consultants that work in this area nationwide, and yes, they do work for the casino industry as part of their engagement in a lot of cases. The consultant we worked with falls into this category, but many states have used these firms being hired by the state to independently look at the evaluations being put forward and to see things like if that level of capital investment and debt being taken out by the operator can reasonably be expected to be paid back, whether that casino at that size and scale is viable in the long term for that market.
I guess it's a little concerning, the fox guarding the hen house.
It is, but they also bring the best expertise available on the topic as well, so it cuts both ways.
Senator, Mr. Chairman, I would also add that, there's nothing that would preclude the state from selecting such an expert through a competitive process, which would be separate from selecting a casino proposal. And so to the extent that the state was concerned about that and the objectivity of the experts that might be brought to bear on this decision, I think that could be done through an open competitive process as well. And I think there's also nothing to preclude the state from using multiple experts so that you could have more than one group or economist look independently at proposals and make their own judgment and then kind of combine their decision at the end. So I think there are lots of ways that it could be done, but I think that is definitely a valid concern.
There are also ways to do sort of back of the envelope rougher calculations to make sure that, this is ballpark possible. Comparing to other states with casinos, similar areas, similar demographic characteristics. If someone's promising 3 times the amount of revenue that casino is generating, that's just not realistic. So you can, there's back of the envelope stuff that we can do internally too, or someone here could do.
I guess I would just want to see J-Lark looking over the shoulders of the independent consultants working for the casino.
And I look back to Hal because I don't want to sign us up for more work. But yeah, you could do something like we did on this project where we bring in someone from the Weldon Cooper Center at UVA. We have our own methodologist and study team and working closely with the consultant on those assumptions and that methodology.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
The question is going to be in relation to outside of the criteria, what other key factors would we need to have in place legislatively prior to getting to this part of the process? I mean, we have sections of the code that are very similar to this, whether it be PPA Act, design, build, seem at risk, have very similar selection criteria within our code. So it's not unfamiliar territory to the General Assembly to have this sort of framework. But there seems to be key elements in terms of the regulatory context, the taxation framework. I guess theoretically we could have a criteria as well that included voluntary tax rate above what we set, or do we have to set a tax rate before we do this? I'm sort of meandering questions about key components that are variables that are interlocked with how someone would respond to a request for proposal.
Yeah, and the short answer is those are all policy decisions. States have done it in different ways. Those are all things that could be considered. As far as what needs to be in legislation, we will have a slide later on that gives a checklist, at least of the high levels of what type of information other states have in their legislation.
But I think you have to have some sort of regulatory framework in place before you get to the stage of asking for proposals, because people don't know how to respond if they don't know what the rules of the playing field are.
That's a good point. Like other types of state procurement, certain preferences could be included in the selection process. So in addition to those general criteria that I just discussed, selection criteria could also factor in other potential state policy preferences such as tribal or local ownership. For example, the Pamunkey tribe have expressed interest in gaming, and they have begun the process of pursuing federal approval for a tribal casino. They have also entered into a land sale agreement with the city of Norfolk. Therefore, the General Assembly could require that any competitive casino selection process include a preference for a tribal or local ownership. If this occurs, in order to avoid undermining the merits and benefits of a competitive selection process, the General Assembly could consider requiring that any preference criteria not outweigh any of the other criteria used to select a proposal. For that reason, we have an option to the General Assembly to consider requiring that any competitive selection process include criteria for casino ownership by a Virginia resident or Virginia tribe. And again, if this occurs, the General Assembly could consider requiring that this preference criteria not receive greater weight than any other individual criteria.
Mr. Chairman, did you all look at whether any other states have required any type of minority ownership percentage for sort of historically, economically disadvantaged communities? And I recognize the Native American tribes have the longest claim on that. I'm not disputing that, but I'm primarily talking about other groups. Because I know, for example, in Maryland, I believe at least in the construction and maybe even in the operation, they have a minority set-aside requirement as part of some of the Maryland operations, I think.
I don't know any off the top of my head, but
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I think it doesn't sound like we have any examples of where states have had that kind of set aside related to ownership and operation of the casino, but there are states that require, in terms of hiring practices, that a certain percentage of employees be minorities, for example.
Okay, further question? So it's fair to say that in terms of minority ownership, maybe some of us think that it might be important to develop more wealth in certain communities. Y'all don't know whether anybody's actually done that or not. Is that a fair statement?
yes, we.
In terms of ownership.
We did not come across it in our research.
Were you looking for it? Is my
We
point.
weren't specifically, no.
Okay. So
But again, like other types of statewide procurement, I think it's a policy decision where there is precedent for preferences in other types of procurement. So I think that would also apply to this if the General Assembly wished.
Further question, Mr. Chairman. So could you all look into that? Because, I mean, it seems to me to be pretty easy to ask or find out in the whatever 30 states that do this. Do any of you have a minority ownership requirement? Because I'd be curious, I would want to have some assurance that that doesn't affect viability or whatever.
Okay.
I mean, you've looked at some other things, but I would want to know what the effect on viability or the bids or whatever would be for something like that. But, you know, there's a lot of talk about equity right now in the last 12 months in this Commonwealth, and to me, that's one way we might be able to make up some ground.
Okay, yep, I think that's something we could.
One potential complicating factor, though, is that these casinos do change ownership. And so you could have that requirement, you'd have to, if you wanted a policy like that, you want to think about how to make sure that it stayed in force for a period of time. You know?
That is a good point.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
so in your analysis, you stuck to the 5 cities from the bill before.
Yes,
The
other
bill
than
before
that,
also
the
gave-
addition of Northern Virginia, just for that one scenario,
Got it.
but yep.
Got it. The bill before also spoke to the Pamunkey tribe having Norfolk and Richmond, but here you have just selection criteria. Is that not included?
Yes, we are advocating for a competitive process for the merits of that process that I discussed before, with this option for a preference, if that is a preference that the state wishes to set.
Sure. So, Mr. Chairman, you say, Pamunkey, you're pursuing federal approval for a tribal casino, so they can do that outside of our structure and our framework, right?
Yes, we're talking here about state-issued commercial licenses. They could also potentially pursue a federal casino, which is a whole different thing with its own set of rules.
Mr. Chairman, so how would, if you do a competitive process and they are not selected, and they could still go down the path of a federal selection process, how does that impact what you've presented?
Yes, we thought about that a lot. There ends up being a lot of hypotheticals in that case, whether they're able to get a federal approval for a federal casino, where it's built, when it's built, how big it is. That is a risk if they don't get a commercial license, that they could potentially pursue the federal route. But it's a complex area of law, and every case seems to be different. So to give any more specificity on what that would look like is really difficult.
Mr. Chairman, last one. So that's for a full-blown casino. Would they have the ability to do smaller sets like Rosie's in places?
Yeah, we
With or
did
without
look
us?
at all this. It's not all perfectly gelled in my mind. I'll look over to the team.
Mr. Chairman, from what I understand, I believe that in order to open either a Class 3 type of casino, which is kind of what we're talking about here, or Class 2, which is slightly different, the Pamunkey would have to have land taken into trust for them. They currently don't have any land that would meet the criteria that would allow them to open a Class 2 or Class 3 casino. They are pursuing that, however, I believe, in a couple of different places in the state, including Norfolk and Richmond. But that is a big sort of leap or step that needs to be taken in order for them to be able to open a comparable casino or something comparable to Rosie's.
And then to get that Class 3 facility, which is the table games and slots, that's another piece of the process that takes further time and effort.
And we do, just for the committee's benefit, we do have an entire appendix that walks you through the process and all of the different steps that would have to be taken in order for the Pamunkey to be able to open a tribal casino and the history there. So it's good reference material.
Many years ago, oddly enough, I was a legal expert in casinos. Very rusty now, but it's my recollection that it takes some state cooperation now for an Indian casino to open up. I don't think it used to be, there was a time when it was designed as a mechanism to get casino gambling in a state that opposed it because they were a sovereign entity. But then I think Congress got involved and said, yeah, okay, this is causing too much disruption. The state has to get on board to some extent. And I believe that is approximately where we stand today.
Yes, it's for Class 3, right? For Class 3 gaming, so the full-fledged casino, there would be a tribal state compact, which would be agreement between the two parties.
Mr. Chairman, I think there is a provision, though, that, and what we have in our appendix is that if a tribe and a state can't reach a voluntary agreement for a Class 3 casino, then the federal government, through the Secretary of the Interior, can issue Class 3 gaming procedures. I think that maybe has not actually ever been used, but there is an avenue for that to happen if the state and the tribe cannot come to an agreement.
Dylan told me it has been used, but very rarely. So again, it's really hard to have any certainty in this area because it's really a case-by-case basis. So I've discussed the process and the criteria, so now we'll move on to who makes the selection. Some states appoint a dedicated committee where the committee's only task is to conduct the casino selection process. This dedicated committee frees up the gaming board to focus on the regulatory process and other startup activities. It also ensures that adequate expertise is available for proposal evaluation. In states that use this tool, members of the dedicated committee may be required to have qualifications that are relevant to evaluating proposals, such as finance and business development experience. Like other citizen boards and committees, members of this committee could be appointed by the governor, the General Assembly, or some combination. Usually the state and not the local government conduct the casino selection process. However, states have used a variety of methods to ensure that local input is incorporated. Virginia could do so by including local representatives on the selection committee or by obtaining local input into the RFP development. We recommend that the General Assembly may wish to consider establishing a committee to evaluate and select proposals for the operation and development of casinos. And we recommend that the committee include individuals with business, finance, and operations experience who represent both statewide and local perspectives. Transitioning now to governance oversight and administration. As you all know, the legislation directed the Virginia Lottery to govern and oversee expanded gaming. We found that Lottery is the only existing state agency that could oversee casino gaming, but in order to do so, the agency would require new staff, new funding, and structural changes. Furthermore, estimated new administrative costs would be about $17 million annually. First, gaming oversight agencies have several responsibilities to ensure integrity and fairness in gaming. This includes licensing and investigation staff who determine who can own and operate or work at a casino, enforcement staff who monitor and ensure compliance with day-to-day operational laws and regulations, accounting and audit staff who ensure proper reporting and tax payments and aim to prevent financial indiscretions, and technology staff who set and monitor standards to ensure that gaming equipment operates fairly and securely. Virginia Lottery is the only existing state agency that could expand to oversee casino gaming. Lottery's existing leadership and administrative structure may provide some economies of scale compared with creating a new standalone entity. Furthermore, that existing staff could initiate the process of expanding the agency's role, potentially resulting in some time savings. We found that Lottery does not appear to have any major shortcomings in its current operations, and its leadership is receptive to expanding the agency's mission. JLARC's consultant and other experts indicate that lottery agencies can effectively oversee casino gaming as long as they are properly prepared and staffed for their new role. However, regulating additional forms of gaming would have a substantial impact on Lottery as an agency. Lottery's leadership and staff indicated their commitment to Lottery's mission to raise funds for public education through the sale of lottery products. Lottery would experience a large expansion in its workload, which could detract, at least temporarily, from that mission. Furthermore, there could be a potential conflict for the Lottery Board and leadership to oversee lottery and regulate casino gaming because the two products could be in competition with one another. However, other states that use a lottery agency to oversee gaming said they have been able to avoid this problem. And furthermore, in addition to undertake these new responsibilities, the Lottery Board itself would also need some changes to membership and responsibilities, which we discuss at greater length in Chapter 8 of our report. As mentioned at the beginning of this section, Lottery could address those challenges with proper changes and resources. However, other proposed legislation in past years has contemplated a standalone gaming oversight agency, so we explored that idea as well. A standalone agency would be an entirely new agency that is primarily responsible for administering and regulating casinos or other forms of additional gaming. Creating a standalone agency could allow for more focused gaming oversight, and leadership of that agency could make decisions based solely on its responsibility to monitor and enforce the gaming operator's compliance with the law, and not also have to consider how that might impact other types of gaming. However, creating an entirely new standalone agency would require more time and resources. Using staffing and expenditure data from gaming oversight agencies in peer states, we found that Lottery is estimated to require an additional 96 employees at an annual cost of $16.9 million to administer gaming. When compared to Lottery, a standalone agency is estimated to need 121 employees at a higher cost of $18.9 million annually. Those additional employees at a standalone agency would be mostly those serving in administrative and executive roles, positions that Lottery already has mostly in place for existing operations. We'll now shift to problem gambling prevention and mitigation. For this section of the report, JLARC staff conducted an extensive literature review on the prevalence and consequences of problem gambling, as well as interviewed experts in the field nationwide. We found that expanding gaming in Virginia will increase the number of people at risk of being negatively affected by gambling problems. The vast majority of people who participate in gambling activities do not experience harm from it. About 1% to 2% of people develop gambling disorder, which is the most serious form of problem gambling. However, the issue is broader than that. An additional portion of the population experience gambling problems that do not rise to the level of being classified as a disorder, and the family and friends of individuals with problem gambling also experience negative effects from their behavior. Our research tells us that a portion of Virginians are likely to already be problem gamblers due to the existing gaming offerings in the state. Expanded opportunities and easier access to gaming would increase the number of Virginia residents who gamble and therefore increase the number of people who are at risk of experiencing negative consequences. Research shows us that the greatest negative impacts from problem gambling are to finances, mental health, and relationships. It is also more likely to affect certain populations, such as individuals with substance abuse disorders, other mental health issues, and those with a low income, the elderly, and military personnel and veterans. Virginia's current problem gambling mitigation efforts are relatively minimal. Existing efforts include a problem gambling helpline, one part-time staff member at Lottery, and one staff member at Lottery that works on it part-time, and one part-time volunteer at the Virginia Council on Problem Gambling. Virginia provides almost no funding for prevention and treatment, despite nearly $700 million in revenue from existing forms of gambling in 2018. An effective problem gambling prevention and treatment program could cost $2 million to $6 million annually. All states with casinos provide public funding for problem gambling prevention and treatment, usually from gaming tax revenue. Virginia's program could be administered by the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services in consultation with the Central Gaming Agency. It would likely require 3 to 5 staff across those two agencies. Finally, to be most effective, implementation of a state program could be coordinated with the responsible gaming initiatives being carried out by private gaming operators. We have a series of recommendations on this topic. The General Assembly may wish to consider requiring applicants for a gaming license to submit a responsible gaming plan, requiring the Central Gaming Oversight Agency to develop and administer a voluntary self-exclusion list, requiring DBHDS to develop a plan and framework for a comprehensive problem gambling program, and because there's already a robust gaming environment in the state, amending the Appropriation Act to establish a dedicated, stable funding source for problem gambling prevention and treatment, regardless of whether additional forms of gaming are authorized. I'll now move on to the discussion of the implementation of casino game.
Let me interrupt you
Sure.
just 1 second. When we agreed to historic racing, we did not require them to even look at that issue. Is that correct?
There is no dedicated funding source from that industry, no new one set forth from historical horse racing. There's a tiny funding source getting way in the technicalities of horse racing, but it comes out to a pretty small number, and that was in effect before HHR. I can't speak. I could speak in generalities. I know that the HHR operators do have their own privately run responsible gaming program. I can't speak the specifics of that, but that is common in the industry, that there are some efforts made on site as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Wouldn't one solution be that we earmark some of the proceeds towards just behavioral health and mental health treatments overall in the state, and then the people would be absorbed and it would be able to help a greater number of people? Would that be an option that we could look at?
I think it could be. I think one of the keys that we saw in other states is allocating that money specifically to problem gaming or things that touch that activity, basically so that money is there for problem gaming and doesn't get absorbed into other efforts.
Follow-up question? But you mentioned in one of the previous slides that there are a whole host of challenges that exacerbate other issues. It seems to me that might be a thoughtful way of addressing this, since we would be bringing in significant revenues to the state. So.
When we spoke with other states about this, that was a concern that many of them mentioned, that the behavioral health agencies are so underfunded as it is, that if they get new money, they're going to use it for whatever crisis they have and not necessarily have anything to develop problem gambling treatment programs. So some of that money gets siphoned off to what the agency thinks are higher and better uses. So that's the risk. But you're right, people have gambling problems, have other disorders as well, and the most effective way to treat problem gambling is to treat them in the context of all of their disorders. That's correct. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Would the fix not be to create the non-reverting special fund and designate portions of the revenue to that funding source in our code, which we do several different places, to a special gambling and support fund?
And a lot of states do. I don't know, I can't speak to whether they have a specific fund or they will just allocate a specific percentage of gaming revenue either to that cause or to a fund. And the point made in our report as well, we're talking about casino gaming revenue. There's also a lot of other gaming going on in the state now where there's other sources of revenue. So that fund or money for that cause could come from a number of sources.
Mr. Chairman, just one final comment. I do think one of the striking things to the team was sort of the very minimal investment that the state currently has for problem gambling, prevention and treatment. And so we do have a recommendation in the report, recommendation 4, that even if the state doesn't expand into other forms of gambling, that the state consider, the General Assembly consider developing a dedicated source of funding for the prevention and treatment of problem gambling for the existing forms of gaming that we have in the state. So we think this is something that needs to be considered even if we don't expand into other forms of gaming.
I'll now move on to the implementation and net fiscal impact to the state. Additional forms of gaming would generate net positive fiscal impact for the state, but the amount would greatly depend on implementation decisions such as the types of gaming permitted and the tax rate applied to gaming revenue. For example, total state revenue would be projected to range from $154 million to $571 million. That's driven most greatly by the tax rate on casino gaming revenue, but also on whether and to what extent other forms of gaming are authorized. State costs are estimated to range from $61 million to $73 million. These account for impacts to other types of gaming that generate funding for the state. Costs are mostly influenced by the decision on how to govern and administer gaming, such as the agency responsible and the extent to which a problem gambling program is funded. Taken together, a scenario with low revenue and high costs is projected to generate just $83 million in net state revenue per year. On the other hand, a scenario with high revenue and low costs could generate over $500 million per year. Because that's such a broad range, we worked to come up with a more realistic estimate based on some key assumptions. That results in an estimated $367 million in net state revenue, the breakdown of which is spelled out here. This is a slide I alluded to a little bit earlier. Comprehensive gaming legislation would be needed to establish the state's gaming principles and priorities. We've listed some of the most important aspects here, and this is based off what we saw in other states' legislation. We estimate that the implementation and development of casinos would take 4 years from the passage of authorization legislation. This is based off the actual observed timeline that occurred in other states. If it's called for in legislation, a voter referendum is the first step that would need to occur. Next, the first 3 to 6 months would largely be the process of establishing an oversight structure, including board appointments, establishing a casino development selection committee, promulgating regulations, and beginning hiring of casino oversight staff. The typical next step in the process is casino development selection. This is that RFP process that I described. It requires time to create and post a request, receive proposals, review proposals, and interview firms as needed, evaluate the feasibility of proposals, and make a final decision. This process also involves licensing key individuals involved with those projects, or with those proposals. Finally, after the project is greenlighted, actual casino construction, as well as further licensing, tends to take an additional 18 months to 2 years. Other forms of gaming, such as mobile or online sports wagering, could be offered more quickly because they don't have that capital piece to them.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Before we leave slide 76, I noticed under the establishing an oversight structure, it said promulgation of initial emergency regulations.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why it says emergency.
Yeah, the terminology of the Administrative Processes Act, emergency regs can be set quicker and not go through that full period. It's what they did with the HHR racing, and then you come back and finalize those. We made the assumption that the state would use that faster process. Emergency sounds more alarming, I think, than it actually is.
And just, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, this is pretty complicated stuff as your work over the last 6, 8 months, whatever it is, illustrates. And I think it's great the work you've done to get this right, or to give us the information so that we might consider getting it right if we adopt any of these gambling, wagering opportunities for citizens. But I would just say, there's no emergency in my opinion, whatever the slow track or the normal track is, because this is pretty complicated. So just wanted to state that.
Yep, that is a valid point.
Temporary,
Yeah.
rather than emergency.
Yeah, emergency is a technical term. They are temporary. But you make a valid point as well. We were trying to balance on this figure that this pressure to do this process fast from some stakeholders, where looking at other states and how long it took. So it's really just a judgment on which process we would use in that assumption. And finally, we reviewed unregulated gaming in Virginia, which are the gray machines or games of skill that have been in the media and discussed during several legislative committee meetings this year. We found that these unregulated electronic gaming devices likely produce substantial gaming revenue and depress revenue from Virginia's authorized forms of gaming. But they lack protection for customers and business owners due to the absence of regulation and oversight. Gray machines are electronic gaming devices in retail locations, bars, and restaurants. Their legality is in question and based on whether they are a game of chance, which is illegal under current state law, or a game of skill, which would be legal. The number of devices have recently proliferated. As of September, there is an estimated 4,500 to 9,200 devices statewide, owned and operated by numerous different vendors. It's a broad range, but based on revenue for Virginia's existing forms of gaming and observed revenue for similar retail electronic gaming devices in other states, JLARC staff estimate that gray machines could produce net gaming revenue ranging from $83 million to $468 million annually. Virginia does not collect taxes on device gaming revenue. Because of their location throughout the state and their revenue potential, gray machines are competing with and likely depressing revenue from other forms of authorized gaming. The unregulated gray machines create risks for players and businesses. The lack of regulation means there's no audits of gaming revenue or compliance activities for the devices, manufacturers, or vendors. This creates risks to businesses and players. As examples, there is no formal accounting mechanism to ensure businesses receive fair payment for hosting devices. Players have no assurance that machines are routinely inspected for compliance, integrity, and fair gameplay. Other states have taken different approaches to regulating gray machines, or to addressing gray machines. Some states, including Virginia at the moment, use a court process to determine the legality of machines. This can present challenges as it requires different rulings on different manufacturers' games or as games evolve. It can create confusion and consume a great deal of legal resources. Other states have placed a ban on gray machines entirely. And finally, some states regulate devices, vendors, and manufacturers and collect taxes on gaming revenue. Georgia's regulatory process is the most highly developed. They use their state lottery to regulate the devices. However, it's expensive, requiring 47 additional staff at the cost of about $15 million annually. We recommend that the General Assembly may wish to require the regulation of gray machines to ensure gaming integrity, protection to consumers, protection to businesses hosting the devices, and minimization of impacts to Virginia's existing authorized gaming. So to summarize our key findings, our study found that realistic net annual state revenue from expanded gaming could be approximately $370 million, but that amount can vary greatly depending on implementation decisions. Impacts on jobs and GDP in localities hosting casinos would be positive, but modest relative to the broader local economy. All Senate Bill 1126 casinos are projected to be viable at a 27% casino gaming tax rate. Existing forms of gaming are estimated to see proceeds declines, but declines would be modest except for the case of historical horse racing. The risk of individuals experiencing harm from problem gambling would increase with the expansion of gaming opportunities. States typically award licenses for casinos to operate using a competitive selection process. The Virginia Lottery is the only existing agency that could realistically be expanded to fill a gaming oversight role at an estimated cost of $17 million annually. A new standalone agency would cost about $2 million more. And finally, implementing casino gaming is a major task. It includes passing comprehensive legislation, holding local referenda, establishing an oversight structure, promulgating regulations, selecting casino operators, and licensing casino staff. That concludes all my prepared remarks. Again, I'd like to thank the entire team on this project. People worked really hard on this over the course of the year. Thank you for the good questions throughout and bearing with me. I can open up to any further questions you may have.
Mr. Chairman, I got a question.
Scott.
So the way I'm looking at this, if you really hate this idea, we adopt some super low tax close to New Jersey, Nevada. We whack historical horse racing 40%. The The costs come in higher than we expect. We got people, gambling, bankrupt, whatever, and we net like $80 million a year to the state. That's like worst case, horrible scenario, right? Best case,
That's the low end revenue estimate.
we adopt some high tax rate. We open a casino in Northern Virginia. The money starts flowing to all of our localities. We generate, with a Northern Virginia casino added, 10 to 12,000 new jobs, and we generate $750 to $800 million a year for the general fund.
Correct.
That's the range.
That is the range.
Okay. I want to know, how is it you guys just decided that it was 367 and that's just the optimal perfect and that's what's going to happen?
That is not the optimal perfect, or for sure is not going to be what happens. That was just trying to make some kind of, like you said, that's a really broad range, to give some kind of illustrative example at the median tax rate with sports wagering and online casino gaming, which were both contemplated during the session, and kind of mid-level administrative costs. If just to narrow that range down, because it's a little unsatisfying to give you that big one.
Further question? Wouldn't you agree the biggest variable in all this is the tax rate we set? Because it looks to me like that, there's like a $200,000 delta there, and of course, the Northern Virginia casino doubles the revenue impact of all this, right?
Absolutely. The tax rate followed by the types of gaming authorized are the two biggest drivers of revenue potential.
Okay. Further question? One other thing I just wanted to get clarity on, I think you all talked about Class 2 versus Class 3 gaming with the Pamunkeys.
Mm-hmm.
Class 3 is the highest level table gaming one, and Class 2 is slots, I think, right? So for the Pamunkeys, there's a lot more hoops they got to jump through for 3, but for 2, they have a lot more ability to do that without jumping through hoops, right?
Yes, there's fewer hoops. They would still have to go through the land into trust process.
Okay, so further question. So if we set up some system that they don't like that sort of minimizes their profit opportunity, they could set up like 10 slot parlors up and down I-95 and 64 or 81, whatever, all over the place. They can show a connection to the tribal land, maybe not the Shenandoah Valley, but at least east of the fall line or something, right? And that variable hasn't been plugged into any of this, right?
That has not been plugged in. And again, getting land into trust at all those points that you just talked about would be required before any facilities were opened. But if they were to get that land into trust, that is a potential avenue that could be taken.
Okay.
At the JLARC meeting, I tried to figure out what the solution was, what the recipe is, Senator Norman finally came up with, of what would create success or failure.
Yes.
And what I asked staff to do was to give me a couple of examples where a casino had been successful and where casinos had been unsuccessful in a state, in a population such as ours. So you want to go through that?
Yep, and we'll give that one another shot. In the broader terms, the trends for when you see a casino that's not successful, a lot of the times it's a casino that's built too large for their market. They don't consider either the market potential or the amount of competition there, or both, or they fall short of their revenue projections. But either way, it's a casino that's unable to meet their debt service or pay their workforce. I allude to on the slides. In some cases, you'll see them ask for either a lower tax rate, they'll lay off workers, ask to renegotiate a host locality agreement. That at the broad level is the formula for what an unsuccessful casino looks like. I'm going to let the team chime in for specifics as they've been able to gather those last day or so.
One of the examples that struck me that the team pulled together, Mr. Chairman, sorry, I'm looking at my phone. I actually have the memo on here, so I'm using it as reference, that there were 4 different casinos that were built in New York and in communities that were similar to the ones that we're contemplating here in Virginia. And 2 of those casinos, the first year of gaming revenue, actually for 4 of them, the projections fell well short, or what they made fell well short of projections. Some of the facilities earned less than half of what had been projected for their first year in operation. And this resulted in at least 2 of the casinos requested relief from the state through a lower tax rate. I think there also were some layoffs. One of the casinos had to sell out in order to avoid bankruptcy. And that really all ties back to having overly optimistic estimates from what they were able to project. And so they overbuilt relative to what their local market could support. And so I think it sort of echoes Joe's point that it's very important to ensure that when a casino is built, it's built to a size and a scale that its local market can support. And that also ties back into a few of the recommendations we have in the report in terms of having some oversight on the process and ensuring that what's being promised is actually realistic and achievable for our communities.
Mr. Chairman.
Is that speaking to this? Okay, go ahead.
What was the tax rate on the New York failed casinos? Do you all know?
Good question. Okay.
For each property might differ by their level of income or gaming mix, but the effective rate across the whole state is 43%.
Just an example, one of the New York ones, the investment was $1.2 billion. One of them was $1.2 billion, and I think that's a case where they overbuilt the size of the population. The 3 that were relatively successful, one in Dodge City, Kansas was 90 million, one in Pittsburgh, Kansas was 70 million, and in Toledo, Ohio was 260 million. You don't have that information. But I found it interesting that we are setting a bar of 200 million, and the ones that were not successful in New York far exceeded that, but the ones that were successful in Kansas, anyway, were far less than that.
I think, there's a couple points there. First, our consultant did account for all those factors and did find that they could all meet a $200 million investment here in Virginia and have, with those revenue estimates that we proposed, meet their debt service and their capital investment. Some of our capital investment amounts for the projections look a little bit lower than some of the things that have been reported for some of the cities here in Virginia and the media. And that was one of the reasons that I think that could be the case, because our consultant really looked to make sure that these would be feasible long-term projects at that size and scale. But on the other hand, to your point on the lower capital investment, each locality is projected to meet that $200 million, because even our smaller localities, Bristol and Danville, do have access to those larger population centers in neighboring states, which might not exist in some of those Kansas, or I missed the other example, but.
But we could solve some of the tax issue that Senator Serval raised if we used a progressive taxation.
Yes, that would be one potential way to address it.
Scott?
I had one other question. So it strikes me that I feel like what's going on right now, at least in terms of this body, is we've just declared Oklahoma territory open and everybody's running in to grab their plot. And I'm wondering whether you looked at how any other states did this and whether any of them did a phased approach where they got their toe in the water, looked at what happened, went a little further, looked at what happened, went a little further to make sure they didn't overcommit and, put the car in the ditch. So, I mean, did you all look at that kind of an approach to see sort of whether that's a better way to go at it?
Not specifically, but I can speak to that a little bit. I don't know if the states did it intentionally or if it's just the way it worked out, but you do see states like Maryland initially had a smaller number of licenses. Pennsylvania has since then added their number of licenses. So you do see this incremental approach. I can't say whether that's intentional or whether it's just market pressure to get more licenses out there once the first batch are gone, though.
Further question, Mr. Chairman?
Continue.
But my recollection, at least what I've been reading in Maryland in the Washington Post, because it's next door and I see in the paper a lot, is that there's the feeling that they're starting to cannibalize a lot. Their revenue's kind of plateaued, and they opened up some new ones, and it hurt some of the ones they already had, and it wasn't clear to me as sort of on a net basis whether they were, you know, moving forward. So I guess maybe that's what happened in New York. I don't know, but
That is absolutely a consideration, and that's part of this idea of keeping geographic separation and limiting the licenses to mitigate that as much as possible. But the MGM casino opening up 2 years ago certainly hurt Maryland Live up the road. But I think the net of that, there was an increase, though.
Any other questions? Hearing none, I guess that completes that. I've told Bristol that they could have 2 minutes, and if there are any other entities that would like 2 minutes after that, they can do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone on the
Thank you,
committee.
appreciate it. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman, Senators. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak here today in regards to this gaming legislation here in Virginia. I'm Randy Eads, the City Manager and City Attorney for Bristol, Virginia. I want to thank, the General Assembly for approving this study to be done by JLARC. I think they've done an excellent job. They've really dug into this issue to determine how gaming will affect the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I think there's a lot to be gleaned from the report. And I also want to say that this report discusses and recommends how Virginia can implement gaming laws that will benefit the Commonwealth and localities where casinos are being proposed. Several positives can be taken from this report. Many jobs in the casinos would require higher levels of skill and pay higher wages than the median wage mentioned in the report. All 5 markets studied, including Bristol, would support a resort-style casino. Sports wagering could be implemented prior to opening of a casino and thus begin an immediate revenue stream to the Commonwealth and the localities. The state's lottery agency could effectively oversee this gaming in Virginia, which is huge in regards to timing. I will discuss several of the things within the report that I've read over the past week. Out-of-state visitors. This report, out-of-state visitors would contribute to the viability of a casino in Bristol and Danville. But it also further states that we would rely on, that it would be a detriment as well if other casinos opened in other jurisdictions. We are located right on the Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina border. Currently in North Carolina, there are 2 casinos operating within about a 2.5-hour drive of Bristol. There are many residents from our area that go to Harris Cherokee Casino on any given weekend. I know for a fact, because I talk to them on a daily basis, that they would much rather prefer to drive 15 to 30 minutes to go enjoy gaming options, entertainment options in the city of Bristol. Per capita income in Bristol is $21,589. That is extremely low. You cannot support a family on $21,589. The JLARC report states that the median income would be roughly $33,000. That's a 50% increase from what people are doing now, and that is huge. The labor force in Bristol, 3.6% unemployment rate, does not take into account individuals who are considered asset limited and income constrained and employed. And that's roughly 10.7% in the city of Bristol, Virginia. I know my time's expired, but there are many things within this report that are very good for Bristol, very good for rural parts of Virginia and impoverished areas of Virginia. And I hope that this committee will consider those good things and how to best implement gaming in Virginia so that we can take advantage of this opportunity. There are not many opportunities that we have where 1,000 jobs will come to Bristol. And I think that's huge. We've lost 1,000 jobs within the past 3 years in the city of Bristol due to Bristol Compressors and Ball Corporation closing. To have 1,000 jobs back with a median income of $33,000 makes a tremendous impact on many families in our area. Thank you.
Nobody here? Any other statements? Okay. There's nothing else. We are adjourned. Continue to read your material and be prepared for Senator Barr.